Well, hello and welcome to today's event. For those of you joining us here live at Swiss Re Next, but also those of you joining us online from all around the world. My name is Nico Luchsinger. I'm the Executive Director of Asia Society Switzerland. I'm delighted today to kick off this four-part series on climate change in the Indo-Pacific that we produced together with Swiss Re Institute. Climate change is, of course, the defining issue of our time, and in many ways the region that we refer to as the Indo-Pacific is the region most affected, as we will hear later. So in the lead up to COP26, the climate conference in Glasgow, taking place in early November, we will look at three separate regions and issues. Today, China's climate change policies. 1 week from today, the health effects of climate change in India. And then 2 weeks from today, carbon removal strategies and nature-based solutions in Australia and Southeast Asia. And in our final episode, which will take place on November 19, so after COP26 has concluded, we will look back and ask what the results of the conference mean for the Indo-Pacific and for the world. Today's event will run for a total of 70 minutes, and we welcome your questions, whether you're here in the room or online at any point. Now, climate change and the global response to it is an incredibly complex topic, and we are acutely aware of the difficulty to address it fully over the course of just a few events that run for just a few hours. So we thought it would be helpful today that before we dive into the topic of today and China's policies, to start with a brief overview of the climate change effects and what they mean for the world, and specifically what they mean for the region of the Indo-Pacific and of Asia. And I'm very pleased to welcome for this first now joining us from Beijing, Hairong Huang, who is the director of Swiss Re's Institute's China Center. Hairong, good afternoon.
Hi, Nick. Good morning.
Hello.
This is Hairong from Beijing.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us. So before we get into the discussion, before I introduce Hailin, who's sitting here next to me, Hairong, we've asked you to give us a very brief overview, just 10 minutes, on the effects of climate change, the expected effects on the global economy and specifically on the region. Swiss Re, of course, has done a lot of research on that, so without further ado, I would leave you the impossible task of neatly summarizing this complex issue in a few minutes. Over to you.
Good afternoon and morning, everyone. So this is Hairong. It's my pleasure to have some minutes here to share the very hot topic about climate change. So let me ask you the first question. What is the most popular color this year for economists? So there must be several. I believe one should be green. So if we don't go green, what will be happened? So the world stands to lose about 10% of total economic values by mid-century if climate change stays on the current anticipated trajectory and the Paris Agreement and 2050 net zero emission targets are not met. So under the current trajectory, global GDP could be 11 to 14% less by mid-century than in the world without climate change. So this is our topic. No action is not an option today. And the recent scientific research indicates that current likely temperature rise trajectories supported by implementation of or mitigation pledges would entail 2 to 2.6 degree global warming by mid-century. So if society doing nothing to combat climate change, the temperatures rise was estimated by rising 3.2 degrees by mid-century. In this scenario, the global economy would be 18% smaller than the world without warming, reinforcing the imperative of, if anything, more action on climate change. And projected to the opportunity, $100 trillion will be the investment opportunity in sustainable finance over the next 3 decades. And a level of greater than $75 refers to global carbon tax, which will be one key element associated with transition risk due to climate change. And this chart shows us what the results would be if we couldn't meet the Paris Agreement goals. The current trajectory of temperature increases, assuming action with respect to climate change mitigation pledges, points to an average global warming of 2.4 degrees by mid-century. In a severe scenario, should the current policies be sustained, and the temperature may go up to 3.9 degrees, nearly double than the Paris targets of 2%. So climate change comes with economic cost, we all know, but how and what size it could be. And we show the chart. It is an overview of climate change impact on world real GDP by mid-century. Our analysis indicates that significant economic damage will occur even with fulfillment of pledges and targets on climate change. So the associated and baseline temperature rise scenario by mid-century shows a loss of global economic output to a world without climate change of 11% and 40% respectively. So this is what I mentioned in a minute earlier. So one thing needs to be pay attention here is we shouldn't only look at the mean of the economic impact when we do the comparison. With the possibility of tipping points being triggered, such as the melting of ice caps or biosphere collapses, so leading to irreversible change in climate change systems, the tail risks of catastrophic economic impacts would become even more pronounced towards the end of the century or later. So our estimates show a larger range of extreme adverse outcomes we can see from this chart. And in the baseline 2 to 2.6 temperature rise scenario, emerging economies in hot regions and oil producers would be most affected by rising temperatures over time. So in the baseline scenario, the world's major economies would contract too, so by as much as 6% or more. Assessing the economic impact could be from two types. One is physical risk and one is transition risk. So considering the GDP impact of the physical risks emanating from a gradual climate change over time, which is we call a chronic risk, and the vulnerability to extreme weather risks, which are acute. This is including most of the NatCat. So like the hurricane, flood, wildfire, etc. Physical risks include property damage, disruption to trade due to the climate shocks, and the lost productivity due to rising average temperatures. And the other type of the risk we call transition risk. So the transition risk result from the adjustment to a low carbon economy, like changes to how society deploy resources, uses technology and rolls out regulation. So this prompt reassessment of asset values generates stranded assets such as fossil fuel deposits or coal reserves and bring systematic devaluation risk to the world financial industry. All these risks could be quantified, modeled by attempt. And this chart can show, we like to say, no country can be immune, as we said. So the chart shows the impact by regions and the economic pain will grow over time. And this chart illustrates the impacts of climate change intensively over time and very notable relative to the Paris Agreement target. These are two phases. First, the countries maintain the similar GDP growth rates as in the past. Emerging economies continue to catch up with advanced market at high speed. With temperatures rising, and economic impacts start to become more noticeable, especially in more exposed regions. Many countries in South and Southeast Asia are particularly vulnerable to adverse effects to climate changes. So a second phase of slowdown in real GDP would start from around 2050, with the impact in terms of reduced economic growth becoming more pronounced in the second half of the century. And this figure shows the degree of mitigated GDP loss. And if the Paris Agreement target is met, and this figure shows, the degree of the mitigated GDP loss. So compared to the baseline scenario, 2.6 degree 2.6 degree increase with multiplied by 10 multiplicative factor under the Paris Agreement with the same multiplicative factor for unknowns. So global economic output could be 10% higher than in 2048 and more than 25% higher in more exposed regions. Emerging markets would be avoid a large part of the expected economic damages, with like Indonesia, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia, and the biggest relative winners. And the transition risks from climate change result from the adjustment to a low carbon economy, such as changes to how society deploys resources, uses technology, and rolls out regulation. Transition risks have implication for the global financial markets. The main impact channel is potential for asset devaluation as a result of the desired move to a low carbon economy, with generation of stranded assets such as fossil fuel deposits or coal reserves. So what's key in the design of potential carbon tax pricing is that is meaningful. So clearly communicated and phased in over time. So comparison can adapt. And the figure estimated the impact of an intermediate global US $100 per ton carbon tax on company earnings by sector and region. So the climate change will have economic costs even if the Paris Agreement goals are met. But the costs could be significantly more severe in alternative scenarios. So the Paris targets remain the best achievable outcome. To get back to and reach those targets will require coordinated global policy action. So climate change is a systematic risk that requires a global coordinated response. So we see the following as key areas to mitigate the worst case climate outcomes: the public and private sectors, including insurers and as a provider of risk transfer capacity, risk knowledge, and the long-term investment, can facilitate transition to a low-carbon economy. And also increasing transparency, data, and disclosure to the price and transfer risks is also needed. To this end, we should see more policy action on carbon pricing coupled with incentivizing natural-based and carbon offsite solutions. So because of time limit, let's have a quick review for our key takeaways today. First, we say that reaching the Paris target would save the world close to 10% of total economic values by mid-century, and also building resilience in climate change prone emerging countries is imperative. The key takeaway is we just mentioned the public-private partnerships and supporting private market process are key to facilitating a smooth transition to a low-carbon economy. So I'll hand back to Nico and for our next section. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Hairong. This was excellent summary. Maybe not the kind of positive news you want to have ideally on a Monday morning, but interesting and important nonetheless. So to just very briefly, I think, take away two things from what you said that I think were super important. One is, of course, that not adapting to climate change, not meeting the Paris targets will come with significant economic costs for the world, and these costs are unevenly distributed. But then I think the other thing you said is so interesting as well, is that the transition risks are there and they're real, and by making this adjustment, we are also, and again, in some regions much more than others, we are running the risk of a negative economic impact. So not doing anything has obviously the much higher economic impact, but doing something and maybe not doing it correctly also has disruptive effects. And I think that already shows you sort of the challenges that China faces, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. And China, I think, is really an interesting case here because how it deals with climate change and how it adapts to net zero is going to be incredibly important just because of the sheer size of the country and the Chinese economy. But then China is also in this unique situation where it does need to continue economic growth at a much higher level than maybe developed economies. It is facing a shrinking workforce population. It has to balance this, and I think the transition risks, we could argue, are even more pronounced in China than elsewhere. So what we're going to be focusing on today is really looking at how China thinks about its path to net zero, what it is doing and what it is not doing, what it is supposed to be doing, and how this all works. And to discuss that, Hairong in Beijing will stay with us, and I'm also welcoming here in Zurich at the beautiful Swiss Re Next auditorium, Hailin Wang, who is a consultant at Sinolytics. Sinolytics is a research-based consultancy firm focusing entirely on China. And Hailin within Sinolytics focuses on environmental issues and climate change issues, previously with Greenpeace East Asia.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks to Swiss Re and also to Asia Society for having me here. I mean, when I was working for Greenpeace 8 years ago, I never expected, the corporate world, the business world could pay so much attention to decarbonization, actually. So it's a great pleasure to be here to discuss with everyone here and also people online.
Thank you very much. Now let's start here, and I want to start with you, Hailin. So net zero is the goal. It's a goal for China. It's the goal for everybody. That's where we want to be, ideally. No, not too far away from now. Can you give us a very quick overview and assessment of, if net zero is the goal, where is China right now? So how far along this path is the country, and how does this compare maybe to other countries on the planet? So what's the scope of the challenge we're looking at here?
Okay, cool. Yeah. Yes, of course, I can start with some basic facts, actually. I mean, if you look at China's total emission, China, of course, everyone knows China is the world's biggest carbon emissioner with a total emission of more than 10 billion tons every year. But then if you look at China's emission per capita, that's actually fine to me. I mean, it's a bit higher than that of Switzerland. It's about the level of EU, but actually much, much lower than that of the United States. But then I think everyone wants China to decarbonize. So I think if I talk a bit more about China's promises, commitments to this, right? I mean, Xi Jinping actually increased China's NDC under the Paris Agreement last December, which is not officially submitted to COP26 yet. I think there are about 6 key important points. First, China, by 2030, China's carbon emissions should peak, and by 2060, China should be carbon neutral. Then also by 2030, China plans to decrease its carbon intensity by 65%. Also, China plans to increase the non-fossil energy percentage to 25% by 2030. Also, China, they want to increase the further stock, and also, most important, China has been saying they want to increase the capacity of wind and solar power to about 1,200 gigawatts. I mean, if you compare all this with Switzerland, I mean, as someone who is living in Switzerland, right? I think China looks less ambitious compared with Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland has been saying it plans to be carbon neutral by 2050, 10 years earlier than China. And also Switzerland has been saying they plan to decrease Switzerland's carbon emission by 50% compared with the level in 1990. So I would say, yes, if you look at commitments, Switzerland looks much more ambitious. But to me, decarbonization, I mean, but if you look at tasks, what is on their to-do list for Switzerland, for China, I think they actually have quite different tasks, right? I don't know so much about Switzerland, but and for China, it would be a lot about, optimizing China's industrial structure. So I would say, if you look at their task, maybe China is not less ambitious, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So again, maybe a little bit to summarize, there's a lot to do still. But when you're sort of doing this overall assessment, you actually believe that at least the targets that China has set for itself are relatively ambitious compared to other countries.
Yes.
One thing I wanted to ask, and we briefly spoke about this before we started the event. So obviously we're in the lead up to Glasgow, which is shaping up to be an incredibly important event. And one thing I was told that countries are supposed to be doing before Glasgow, and most of them have, is submit what's referred to as the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So this is sort of when a country says what they're actually, concretely going to be doing, sort of as an intermediary step towards these targets that they're announced now. China hasn't submitted them. The deadline was July 31st. There was another deadline, I think, last week, where most people assumed that they would submit it, and they haven't. Can you talk? This is a somewhat technical issue, but I think it's an interesting example just to learn, what's going on there. Why would China not submit a target that they have promised that they would submit on time? Can you explain the delay?
I mean, I agree, it's a quite technical question. I mean, at least what I see, I think within China, Chinese leaders have been suffering, have been struggling with all this agenda. I mean, before, I don't know the exact timeline, but before, MEE, Ministry of Ecology and Environment, has been making a plan, China's overall strategy to net zero. But then somehow, at some point, NDRC, and I think the Chinese are not so happy with MEE, right? So the NDRC actually takes over the role of MEE to make the plan, to strategy, to net zero. But then I think the last week's meeting, China's climate change cooperation meeting with the EU, China actually said they wanted to submit a low carbon emission strategy by COP26 by November, actually.
Mm. Okay. So, Hairong, you, in your presentation, I think talked, as we mentioned, just very briefly about these transition risks from a global level. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the specific challenges you see China facing on its path towards net zero? So there's obviously a lot going on there, but specifically, what are the things China needs to overcome to be able to reach that goal effectively?
Yeah, thank you, Nico, and also thank you, Hailin. Hailin just mentioned the China, the carbon emission as facing the very high pressure, because that's a percentage. I can also share with you the carbon emission for China already reached 28% of the global carbon emission. So it is really a critical, right now for China, and also we can see the ambition of Chinese government to reach this net zero, the goal by the timeline. And definitely we see some challenges for this initiative. Since in the past, we all know that in the past over 10 years, China is facing experienced the fast growing economic stage. And now in China, is entering the second stage, is to the high quality development stage. So as present, China is a new period of economic and also the social transformation from the high speed development to high quality development stage. So this transition brings many uncertainties. And this is both an opportunity and a challenge for China's green development. So the transition risk will be more critical if the economic transition is speeding up. And it's not just a single issue of people just always talking related to the environmental protection, energy or industry, but also an overall issue involving economic and social development. So the transformation of this development strategy not only includes the transformation of industry and energy fields, but also involves the green transformation of the financial industry and also the financial system. So the green transformation of the financial system includes not only the establishment of the carbon trading markets and the promotion of the ESG investment, but also the new risk assessment of the whole entire financial system. And there's a study of the new investment models and an adjustment of a financial regulatory mechanism to build a green goal and industrial adjustment that suits itself. So this is we call the transition risk. And as far as this transition risk is concerned, on the one hand, traditional energy sources such as coal and steel and high carbon assets are facing tremendous transformation pressure, which may form a huge amount of the non-performing assets. So on the other hand, energy supply and the price shocks under carbon emission constraints are also hidden risk. So this is some of my views about for your question, Nick.
Thank you. And I think we're going to get into some of this also in more detail at a later point. I do want to, Hailin, ask you about something that sort of dominated the China-related news in recent weeks. It wasn't necessarily reductions of emissions; it was energy shortages. So there were a lot of stories about several parts of China facing, power cuts, power reductions that caused a lot of trouble. That's obviously it's not a good look for a government that wants to promote and continue economic growth. So how does that story factor in? Are these shortages in any way related to the transition already? Will they make China maybe more hesitant to commit to specific targets for fear of disrupting the energy supply if they transition out of carbon? What is the link between that story and the path to net zero?
Yeah, sure. I think this incident you just talked about is actually linked to the decarbonization agenda of China. I mean, just to understand the facts correctly on the ground, right? I mean, in order to decarbonize, one of the instruments China has been using is called the energy intensity, which means the energy used per GDP unit, right? I mean, China has been setting up target for this. I mean, for 14th five-year plan, the next 5 years, China plans to decrease its energy intensity by around 18%. I don't remember the exact number, but I mean, in order to, and each province is getting their, their target for this energy intensity. And what happened in the last few months, on one hand, there's a shortage of coal supply, but on the other hand, in some provinces, for provinces like Jiangsu and Guangdong, the most developed areas, I mean, their energy in the first half of this year, their energy intensity has actually increased. So in order to, to finish their provincial target for energy intensity, this province had decided, to start rationing electricity. That's part of the story you just mentioned. And I don't really think this is going to be a pushback or China will decrease its dedication to decarbonization because of this incident, I would call, right? I mean, even facing this energy rationing, as you said, right, this has been destabilizing the supply chain in China, also, I would say, worldwide, right, a bit. I mean, I think 2 weeks ago, NDRC, right, it actually reaffirms that China would continue its control, its target for energy intensity. And moreover, I think NDRC have been saying, they require the local government to start managing their energy budget and also to limit permission to high energy, investment into high energy consuming projects. So I would say, based on the attitude from NDRC, I would say, yes, let will continue everything. But then I think, on the other hand, I think they have been trying to adjust their approach, right? I mean, Xi Jinping, in July, Xi Jinping has been saying, let's try to avoid the decarbonization revolution, which means, a very aggressive means to decarbonize China's economy, right? Of course, Chinese leaders are not so happy about what is happening, right? In order to get the energy intensity target, then you start rationing energies. The Chinese leaders are not so happy. So following Xi Jinping's call, for example, the ZURICH, it is like Switzerland, FINMA in Switzerland, right, has been requiring all the banks and insurance to meet the necessary needs of all of the coal industry, of the coal power plants, of all the other industries who do not look so green these days. So I would say the dedication to decarbonizing continued, but then with an adjusted approach.
Mm-hmm. And I want to follow up on something because you mentioned energy intensity, and that's a concept that I think is crucial in the Chinese context. The carbon trading scheme that China launched not too long ago is also in a way based on energy intensity and focus. So can you talk to us? You briefly mentioned that in some provinces actually energy intensity went up, which of course is the opposite of what's supposed to happen. It should go down. So what are the effects there? Why would energy intensity go up in certain industries? Is that a limited effect, or are we seeing this on a more broader scale?
I think there are multiple reasons for this. On one hand, because of the epidemic, right, the demand for made in China products has actually soared in the past 1 or 2 years. On the other hand, I think it's mostly because of the mindset of local government. Actually, they issued too much permission to these high energy consuming projects at the beginning of this year. And then at the end, because of the COVID, all these projects actually are fully operated or more than fully operated. At the end, they consume too much energy. That's the story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. So I think we got a pretty good sense of the scope of the problem and what's happening and the challenges that the Chinese government and China as a whole needs to overcome. Let's now dive into what's actually happening. And Hairong, I read a good article recently that said China has a target, and I think we've just discussed these targets. China actually has several targets, but it doesn't yet have a plan. And again, it probably doesn't make it all too different from a lot of other countries. So I was wondering whether we could talk a little bit about, what such a plan could look like and what it could be. So,
yeah.
If you're a high-level Chinese government official, you come into the office on a Monday morning, such as today, and your job is to get to net zero. What do you actually do? What are the levers that you can pull as the government to ensure that this transition happens, ideally, while minimizing all the transition risks that you had mentioned? So what are the key levers, the key policies that China has at its disposal to get there?
So, hi, Nick. Very good question. So first, I'd like to answer first that the Chinese government actually already took the actions from several years ago. So we can have very quick view. Say, I'm not going to, very completely organize all the actions, but we can just by timeline. Early from 2013, almost 8 years ago, and China already started. They published the national, the strategy for adapting the climate change. And in that measures or the policy, they have the action plan to forbid or limit the new coal energy plants in the ocean, the coast areas, so the provinces. So that already started from 2013. And in the next year, also the Chinese government published another measure and policy. They also target. Have the plan to target 2020 as 700 the unit for the renewable energy target, and also the 2015 and China. For the promised will be the 2030 will be the carbon peak time. So this is also this year the government announced again. So it's always consistent. And in 2016, in the 2016, I think China is also promised it's going to provide $4.1 billion to sponsor the development, to development the climate change and the issues. So this is, and also the same year China also joined the Paris Agreement to sign the agreement. So that's the 2016. And the next year, 2017 and 2018, China also continuously to release the new policies and the measures to help the industry to meet this target. So I think for example, for the energy, promote the energy energy conservation and the emission reduction with the energy the revolution. We call this is the energy revolution time. So the industrial structure adjustment and the promotion of the new energy vehicle as the main focus. And in the short term, energy conservation and the emission reduction are the focus of the carbon neutral policy. So I think the Chinese government already take the action several years ago and continue to promote this target. And in the term of energy, advance the energy revolution, restrict the use of fossil energy, and promote the development of the clean energy, such as wind energy and the photovoltaics. So this is what I mentioned to just have a quick review. And for the future, I think the continuously improve the supporting facilities such as green finance and the carbon emission trading. This is also, we can see, the carbon trading market is an important supporting facility for carbon neutrality and will be launched in July. Already launched in July. So the national carbon emission trade market for the power generated industry is launched online, and the Shanghai Central Exchange has issued the announcement of the matters related to national carbon emission trading. So these are all the government actions we can see. And also in China, the green finance policy guidance can effectively guide the flow of the funds to low carbon products and services. This is another policy we can see, but the detail, the measures and also the regulations, we can just see in the later from the government support.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Sorry, thank you so much, Hairong. I think this is an excellent overview. I think you listed all the things that we currently talk about when we talk about these things. So there's obviously for a government, you can just prohibit or restrict something. You can have subsidies. You can maybe promise investment, and then there's of course the market-based solutions, emissions trading schemes that we briefly mentioned earlier. Now, if we dive into these, Hailin, as Hairong has mentioned, China isn't just starting doing this. There's been a few years already of experience on both the national and the local level. Can we already derive a little bit of insight from that in terms of what worked and what didn't. So if we look at all the things that China has done so far on any level in terms of trying to reduce emissions, is there something that stands out, a scheme, a policy that was specifically successful, and maybe something also that wasn't so successful, that has been abandoned in the meantime?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, I think Hairong has already mentioned a lot of policies, right, from China in the past years. And then to me personally, I think what I find fantastic about China's policy is like, I think China's policy for improving the supply of clean energy or green electricity in China, also improving the consumption of green electricity in China. I mean, China had been subsidizing the green electricity industry for more than 10 years now. On one hand, for the supply end, right? I mean, the supply of green electricity has increased by 10 times in the past 10 years. But then on the other hand, I think on the other hand, what is more interesting and what is unique to China is like, I think this subsidy in the past 10 years has actually successfully helped China to localize supply chain, to lower the cost of green electricity. I mean, NEA, National Energy Administration, says that in the past 10 years with this subsidy, the cost for solar power has decreased by 75%, and the cost for onshore wind power has decreased by 35%. This means, the subsidy has actually made the industry much more financially and much more sustainable in the long term, which also explains why today, at this moment, when the subsidy for green electricity has phased out, but then the high growth of green electricity in China did not slow down. Actually, the growth of green electricity is actually being higher if you compare that with 2020. I think most importantly, I think this also means, the future development of the green electricity in China would be more dependent on the market ability or willingness to consume green electricity, right? I mean, since 2016, China has set up the policy, they actually set up what is called the mandatory consumption of clean energy mechanism in China, which means only primary electricity trading market users, which means the users who really go to the electricity market to buy electricity are obligated to consume a certain percent of green electricity each year. And let's see how this mechanism could further, ensure the consumption of green electricity in the next 10 years, maybe.
So this is interesting because what you're saying is the success story is the increase in supply and consumption of green energy, and that seems to have been achieved through a combination of subsidies, but also then like actually strict requirements towards certain market actors. Is there something that hasn't worked? Is there a climate change policy that China has tried and abandoned for lack of efficiency?
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, I have to say I don't really see any policy that I personally don't see not working effectively, right? Because, for example, China has the target for the carbon intensity, but then I don't really see specific policy for that. So at least for the party that are already here, I think most of them are working effectively. But the one thing I just wanted to mention here, Switzerland is, I think some colleagues here are Swiss, right? I think Switzerland is quite different from China, right? I mean, for Switzerland, Switzerland can say, I want to change my energy mix. So I decided to abandon the nuclear power plants in a few years, and then just maybe buy electricity from France, right? But then China is quite different. So I would say, for me, for now, as I said, I mean, China is having a lot of ambitious targets, but then I don't really see many more specific policies. And also, most importantly, China is not having a target for total carbon emission, which makes sense to me because we have to be realistic on this agenda for China. So. To your question, I think for the policy layer, I think they're working effectively, but then that's because they don't have unrealistic policies.
Yeah. Hairong, we tend to think of China's government as kind of like monolithic, and that's of course not true. It's a huge country, and it's a big and complicated bureaucracy, even at the national level. And then of course we have the local level, we have the provincial governments, we have the big cities. So can you talk to us a little bit? In that whole set, where do you think, besides the highest national level, what importance and what responsibility to provincial level and local governments have to implement these policies? Is this something that's really mostly done at the national level, or is there a lot of activity as well, sort of on the local levels of government? And do we even maybe see differences between different regions and provinces in terms of how they look at the issue?
Yes, that's also a very great question. Also, people, they are thinking about that, even for the different levels of the Chinese government sectors. And as I mentioned before, this low carbon transition target is not a very simple action plan. So it means a comprehensive systematic change from the energy production to energy consumption. So which means the target is there, but down to the prevention level. So what is the system should be, right? So the system should be the policy system and the industry system and the covers all. And also what is how to quantify to meet these targets. So these questions, I think people here right now in China, they are focusing to go deeper to explore and have the more understanding and the more solution about it. And meanwhile, when people try to meet the target, they also need to think about, as I mentioned, transition risk. This is a challenge. How do we keep the economic growth? How do we just eliminate the impact due to the transition stage? So I think this is what I maybe it's for your question. That's not a very sure answer at this moment, but we see among the government the strategic discussion, also the plans, and this already be observed. So how do they build up the tops, the structure to help the development of this decarbonization? And the second is how to quantify.
I want to talk a little bit, not too much because we're going to be spending a lot of time at the final event, but of course we're doing all this in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow. And we briefly mentioned just before this uncertainty with China not having yet submitted their NDCs. Hailin, if you look forward to Glasgow and if you try to think about the most optimistic scenario that you still consider to be realistic, what would it be in terms of China doing or committing to doing in the course of Glasgow? So what can we expect? Sort of what's the, and sort of on the spectrum of things that we can expect, what's the most optimistic scenario? What would be a big, what would be considered a big win if China would do X, Y, Z?
Mm-hmm. Sorry. I mean, I'm realistic, so I won't really provide a very positive answer to your question. I mean, first to your question, I think China would only submit Xi Jinping's promise last December to COP26, and I don't think they would further strengthen the Xi Jinping's promise. And I think there are two.
Just because that promise was to be at net zero at 2060, right?
Yes,
that was his commitment.
Exactly.
Yes.
Also, only target for non-fossil energy and everything 6 points, right? And of course, because they are anyway not submitted officially yet. But I think there are two reasons for my judgment, right? First of all, I was talking about Xi Jinping saying let's try to avoid decarbonization revolution, because the Chinese leaders think some local governments, as you said, right? They believe some local governments have been too aggressive. But I think most important, I personally have noted this wording change in the public statements by the Chinese government. I mean, in April, in the United States, Chinese statement addressing climate crisis, China was saying they're about to submit the carbon neutrality strategy to COP26. But in last week's meeting with the EU, in their public statement, China was saying they're about to submit the low carbon emission strategy to COP26. So April is coming from carbon neutrality strategy to low carbon emission strategy. I mean, I personally think this wording change indicates that China is getting much less aggressive and try to create some leeway for their future actions. Of course, someone can argue, combined with carbon sink technology, right, or storage technology, this local carbon emission could mean net zero as well. But I personally just think, this means China will be much more cautious and much more I don't think they would provide much more aggressive promise to COP26.
And why is that? So what you're saying is that even the most optimistic scenario is that China's sort of holding back a little bit, creating leeway for itself, maybe not overcommit to things. Isn't there an argument to be made that, if they came out at Glasgow and had this big sweeping promise, this could actually be very good for China. They could assume a leadership role on a global issue where no one else seems to want to be a leader right now. So why do they actually want to create leeway for themselves? What is the political thinking behind that?
I mean, I agree. First, I agree with you. Xi Jinping has saying, let's try to, lead the world about decarbonization and about green development. China wants to be a leader here, but then if they make, they overpromise, then it's a serious international promise, and they can make it, at least can damage Chinese reputation worldwide, right? So I think of course, they want to create some leeway. Of course, on the other hand, as China has been saying a lot, right? We, as a developing country, we're happy to contribute to fulfill the duty of developing countries. So I think they're quite realistic here.
So this could be also just please, Hairong, go on.
Hi, Nick. So may I add 2 points from my side as you're talking about the COP26? So from my side, I think that the optimized scenario would be one, Chinese government also wants to enhance the global cooperation for this initiative because Paris Agreement is not one country issue. So this is a global action. And the second is we can see that at this time, the Asian countries like the China, Japan, and Korea, they add in. So they will add more important roles and values for this initiative to reach this goal.
Thank you. I think that's those are two very important points, especially the one about sort of also regional cooperation is one that we don't talk about often enough. Now, I do want to spend some time afterwards also talking about different industries and how they're affected. But before we get there, we've talked about this issue, Hairong, mostly in the context of what's the Chinese government doing, how are maybe certain industries reflected. And I was wondering, you are of course in China. How, in your view, does the public discourse on climate change in China look like? Right? So it feels to me that here in Switzerland and most other European countries, there's been kind of like a little bit of a sea change, maybe over the last 2 years or so, where the issues become much more prevalent sort of in public conversation, and a lot more is being written about, and people like myself who aren't spending their days looking at this issue entirely are sort of more acutely aware of it. Where does China stand in this process? Is climate change and the need to get to net zero and the need to sort of make big sweeping changes to achieve that, is that something that's being discussed in the Chinese public sort of on a regular level? What is your sense?
Yeah, very good. So it is true. In China, in the different different types of the government regulation committee, they all initiating or all right now is discussing what is the future plan, or how to enhance the management from the regulatory side. So because our Switzerland is working in the insurance industry, so from my side, we Switzerland Institute in my team also help the Chinese insurance society to edit and write the Chinese green insurance white book. So they already published this June. And the insurance industry, because we also give the full play to its unique advantage in risk identification and risk management, risk protection, and venture capital to support the green transformation of the economy. So this is very important for our the company and also the insurance industry as well. And we can see from the three functions we can do. First is the green operation. So when with the main goal of the reducing the own carbon emissions, so insurance companies should implement intensive operations, intelligent management, and also the digital service to improve the resource operational efficiency and reduce energy consumption. And the second function is green insurance. On the liability side, the insurance industry will continue to broaden the scope of the protection, the innovative insurance products, and provide risk protection for green energy and green transportation and green building, green technology, climate governance, and forest carbon sinks, and also serve the real economy and the green transformations. That's the second function. And the third is green asset. On the asset side, the insurance also funds have the advantage of the long-term flexibility and stability, so which can better match the long-term financing needs required for green development. And echo to our products or the insurance market. So we can see that we discussed also the put in our white page. It is we have the insurance can protect the different areas, the full function areas. So one is the green energy and the transportation and the green building, green technology, and climate risk, and also the environment governance, and also the carbon sink. So these are all most of the areas for the decarbonization and the insurance can do. So we estimate like above 20%. The green insurance premium will be increased by years, and the biggest side the part for the insured area from our side will be the green, the transportation, and also the environment, and also the energy, clean energy. So there's some areas we can observe. So actually, I cannot answer all of the industry, but for my area, I can just share some of that with you.
Thank you very much, and no need to sort of look at all industries, but I do want to follow up, since again we're talking about the obviously insurance industry, and one of the nice things about that is that I think you have a good view into a lot of other industries, to the extent that you're providing insurance products there. So you talked at the very beginning in your presentation, again, you talked about the transition risk, and you had this chart where we saw, sort of transition risks in different industries and different regions. And I think that's kind of like obvious, right? Where in which industries there are the biggest transition risks. Is there also an argument to be made that there are industries that actually have transition opportunities? So there's obviously, I'm assuming the industries that produce car batteries will benefit, obviously, if there's a subsidy for electric vehicles. Are there other industries, talking about the Chinese market now, that could actually benefit from this whole process? So where there's going to be not a transition risk so much, but actually an increase in business opportunity to do this change? Where should we look?
Yeah. So we can see all the green-related industries should be the potential opportunities, right? Including, I just mentioned, the energy technology especially, and also the transportation, architecture, the buildings, and infrastructures, I mean the green, and also the climate change and the environment risk management. And these are all the opportunities we can see. So if we summarize, it would be the energy saving and environment management, and also the talking about, this is from the reduce the carbon. And if we talk about, there's another is a carbon absorb the carbon, and anything, the technology like related to the carbon absorb, this is also another opportunity. For example, in agriculture, so the agriculture, it would be the eco, like a carbon sink, and also capture the carbon, right? So there's also another opportunities we can see in the future.
Thank you. Hailin, I wanted to ask you, so we talked about the role of the insurance industry. I think we have a somewhat good idea of which industries could benefit from this transition, and of course which industries are most at risk from these transitions. And now, if we look at this, from a European perspective, in Switzerland and other European countries, you would expect from the industries that are negatively affected, maybe certain energy providers, petroleum companies, you'd expect political pushback, right? So there's a process, and these companies maybe go out and lobby and try to make the transition at least less burdensome, less onerous for them. Is that effect there in China as well? So if we look at all these coal plants in China, those are big companies. They obviously, they have power, they have clout. Do they have political clout? Can we expect pushback from this industry towards certain targets, or is that not an effect that plays in China at all?
I think personally I have already witnessed some short-term pushback, I would say, right? I mean, if you look at the current electricity shortage that is happening in China now, right? I think from July, China has actually forced to recover the production of over 30 coal mines in the north part of China, because there's just not enough sufficient supply of coal power. Also, they actually the Chinese government has been trying to encourage the coal power plants to increase their supply of electricity. But I would say this pushback is in the short term due to the energy safety reasons. If you look at in the long term, actually, if you look at Li Keqiang's meeting for energy supply 2 weeks ago, on one hand, he has been saying let's increase the supply of coal power and also the coal power related electricity. But on the other hand, he has been saying let's accelerate the construction of wind and solar power, which means so that China could be less coal dependent in the longer term. So I would say there might be pushback in the short term, but in the long term, China has now changed its dedication. China has been quite strong on this point.
Yeah. So there's. What you're saying, there may be short-term pushback, but there's no evidence so far that kind of like industry action, lobbyism from certain industry would sort of change the overall direction in the longer term.
No, I don't really see it long-term, but maybe in the short term, I know some European companies they have been asking for clarification of energy supply in China, right? But I don't really see it long-term, lobby for this, no.